Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and back to our, as I said last week, regularly scheduled doldrums. And this week I'm sort of breaking my no series when I'm doing another series rule. And that's because this is one of those books that is technically part of a series but isn't really. You'll occasionally run into these books that are written by an author, and that author will place that book somewhere in his or her series, but nothing more than a throwaway line or two is actually an indicator that this particular book fits into that series. And Deerskin is one of those books. Now I'm going to move off of this and onto a different cover, this cover. And the reason why I'm sticking with this cover as opposed to the other one is because, as I always say, I like to stick with the cover that is the one I grew up with. And this is the cover that I had growing up. I don't know where my copy of this book went, but I don't have it anymore. And this book is a retelling of the Perrault fairy tale of Donkeyskin. Now, the fairy tale of Donkeyskin is much less grisly than this book. It's much less horrifying. Now, it's not that it's the only version of that particular story. As with most folk tales, you can always find other versions of this story. The Brothers Grimm have one. But Perrault's, as with a lot of Perrault's stories, is much, much lighter. And I think that has to do with the sort of audience that Perrault was going for, in that he was putting together stories for the French aristocracy to listen to light entertainments. And the French aristocracy listening to their light entertainments very rarely want to hear about the truly grisly sorts of things that happen in fairy tales. It's not that there are no grisly things, but I get the feeling that in his version of Cinderella, it's perfectly fine that the stepmother and stepsisters just sort of vanish into the background because they were punished enough by chopping off bits of their feet to try to stuff it into Cinderella's slippers. The fairy tale of Donkeyskin is the story of a princess, and her father and mother are very much in love, and her mother is an incredibly beautiful and accomplished woman, and when her mother is dying, the queen is dying, and she makes the king promise that he will never marry a woman who is less accomplished or less beautiful than her, because she tells him, "I don't want you to be forever comparing the poor girl to me." And Perrault puts in as a sideline that the queen was doing this because she actually never wanted the king to remarry, and she was well aware of how amazing she was and how beautiful and accomplished she was, and she was pretty sure that he would never find anybody her equal, so making him promise this meant that he would never do it. Well, the king, when his daughter grows up, he realizes that his daughter is as beautiful and accomplished as his wife, and because he does wish to remarry again, he realizes the only way to remarry and to fulfill the oath he gave his wife at her deathbed is to marry his daughter. And he tries to marry her, and his daughter, in a panic, summons her fairy godmother, who tells her to ask impossible things of the king, but the king is determined, and he does these impossible things anyways. And the fairy godmother eventually, because there is a donkey who poops gold in the palace stables, she asks the fairy godmother, tells her, "Tell the king to give you the skin of this donkey, because he's not going to skin the donkey that poops gold." Literally, it poops gold. And if I had a donkey that pooped out gold, I probably wouldn't do anything to it either. But the king is determined, and he gives her the skin anyways, and the fairy godmother, realizing that if he's that determined there's nothing they can do, basically gives the girl the skin and says, here, if you wear this, no one will recognize you. You'd better start running. And so that's what the princess does. And she finds her way to another kingdom where she is recognized by a prince who falls in love with her. And there's a certain amount of, ooh, you can't marry the ugly Donkeyskin girl, only then she shows up in her dress and marries the prince. And the king shows up, having apparently returned to sanity, and gives them his blessing. And everybody lives happily ever after. Deerskin is very much bleaker than that. In what has become a tradition for many of these rewrites of fairy tales, Robin McKinley goes into this, and aside from giving a throwaway reference to The Hero and the Crown, a throwaway reference being, yeah, Lady Erin once hunted dragons. That must have sucked. Yeah, I guess so. That's like the whole thing. Anyways, but what happens in this is Princess Lisa Lasar is raised on the fairy tales of her mother, who was the most beautiful woman in the world, and her father, who traveled across the world to get, fruits from kingdoms at the ends of the earth, and came back for her mother, and they loved each other so much. And she grows up with a nurse who tells her these stories over and over and over again. And what's very, very interesting, of course, is when her mother dies and extracts this promise from the king after a really, really horrifying tale about the artist who was hired to paint her portrait, and that artist is, oh boy, is that story of the artist chilling on its own. But her mother dies, and Lisa Lasar, the princess, discovers that she doesn't love her parents. She doesn't know her parents. Her parents were so bound up in being the wonderful king and queen, the most beautiful woman in all the world, and her husband who loves her so, that they seem to have kind of forgotten they even had a daughter. And she's been invisible. And she stays invisible until she turns 15 and her mother dies, and she finally starts to assert herself bit by bit. And for the next couple years, these are wonderful years where she flies under the king's radar entirely. And the kingdom is governed basically by a coterie of ministers who just sort of tell the king to, sit quietly and not cause trouble. And he mostly doesn't cause trouble because he seems to have sunk into a depressed stupor. And then, all of a sudden, when Lisa Lasar turns 17, her father sees her, and he finally recognizes how much like her mother she is. He sees how beautiful she is, and he remembers his wife's demand that he not marry anyone less beautiful than she. And he falls in something with his own daughter. And she protests, and the ministers protest, but the king insists. And the night before he is to marry her, because he has insisted upon it, he breaks into her rooms and he rapes her. And the book doesn't pull punches. I mean, it doesn't describe every last moment, but there's a lot of talk of blood and of pain and fear and self-loathing. And this is a book that probably, if it had been written more recently, would come with trigger warnings, because if somebody has been a victim of rape, if they read this book, it may throw them a loop. But one of the big things in this book is how very, very clearly at the end she spells out that Lisa Lasar, who's been hiding behind the identity of Deerskin, she so clearly spells out the fear that she felt and the self-loathing and the confusion and that sense that it had to be her fault because he was the king and her father and he had to be right. And it's this amazing, and the climax of this book, is her facing off with her father, is her showing up because the prince who she has fallen in love with, the prince's sister, has become engaged to the king, has become engaged to her father. And after hiding for so long, after the prince asked her to marry him because he had fallen in love with Deerskin, he'd fallen in love with the woman that she is, this woman who has a wonderful dog who you see on the cover. Ash is a dog and is a big character who I haven't even talked about, and I only have 4 minutes left, so you're not going to hear much at all about Ash, or about the Moon Woman, or about the many, many, many plot points in this book. She faces off with her father at the end to save the princess, to save the prince's sister, and it's this climactic scene where you just see this, all of this horror, all of this anger, all of this self-hatred is laid out, because so much of this book is about her trying not to think about it, about her trying to recover, about her trying to figure out who she is, about her saying, I am not this, I am something else, I don't know who I am, I just know that I know I like dogs. And this climax of the book, where she recovers her identity, where she reclaims it, is very, very powerful. Or at least it always felt that way to me. And the interesting thing about the ending is very much, in some ways, and they lived happily ever after. But the ending is also very much a matter of, she tells her prince that, yes, she loves him, but she's not sure that's enough. She's not sure she's enough. She's not sure she can be enough for him. And the book almost leaves us dangling on a question, because yes, at the end they're hugging and they're so close that you cannot see any space between them. They seem as though they were one person, and all of that sort of poetic nonsense. And Robin McKinley does tend to a slightly stilted romantic style of writing, for the record. It's a very romantic thing, but at the same time there remains that question of what happens when they let go. And you can let it be a happily ever after, or you can let that question hang because you're still not sure she won't run. But I personally enjoyed this book, and I found it interesting, and personally I found it powerful, but that's very much a matter of, I think that's a matter of personal taste, because I've seen some people criticize the fact that there's a lot of nothing that happens in the middle of the book. But a lot of that nothing is a lot of soul-searching. The dog on the cover, Ash, does play a very, very big role, because Ash is what pulls Lisla out of her depression. Deerskin, that is. As many people with depression have said their pets do. And she's an important character, and she's adorable and fuzzy and a dog, and so, we all like her. But that's my recommendation, and at some point I'll actually get around to the other books in the so-called series, The Hero and the Crown, and The Blue Sword. And that's everything, and I'll see you next week.